Welcome to the Into AI Safety podcast, where we discuss the challenges facing the field of AI safety and those who work within it. This show aims to provide the foundation and resources needed to get up to speed on safe and ethical AI. As always, I am your host, Jacob Hames. During the podcast, you may hear this sound, which denotes that I have included at least one link related to the content that preceded the sound. The purpose of this is to allow for citations and providing resources without breaking the flow of conversations. As per usual, items mentioned during asides will have links in the show notes as well. This episode was recorded on March 7th, 2026, and asides were recorded on May 1st, 2026. Alert, alert, new show incoming. That's right, today's episode isn't just another installment of Into AI Safety, it's also the announcement of a new show joining the Kairos FM network, Beyond the Paycheck, reclaiming the case for UBI in the age of AI. And the host and creator is my guest for this episode. You're not going to be able to guess how I met him, so I'll just share it because I think it's fun. He applied to and made it to the second round for a research project manager role I was conducting the hiring process for in late 2025. And I saw he had experience as a podcast host for the New Books Network, a literary podcast, and that his journey is one that I thought people would be particularly interested in hearing more about. When I sent out notice that we wouldn't be continuing with his application, I also mentioned Kairos FM and that I'd be willing to help out if he was ever interested in driving his own project. Up to recently, when he began his PhD, his experience was as a freelance translator. In 2025, the stream of translation work which he had been relying on began to dry up. And while he has a few clients who still want high-quality, long-form translation, the subsistence tasks are no longer as reliable, largely thanks to AI. It was this catalyst that pushed him to think even further about the focus of this series, Universal Basic Income, or UBI, and why some individuals in the tech aristocracy are so outspokenly in favor of it. Think of this conversation as a teaser and a chance to get to know the host of the new short-run audio documentary from Kairos FM, Beyond the Paycheck. We cover his background in more detail, whether this time is really different with regards to labor displacement, the limits of discourse analysis as a practical tool, and I even coin a new term which I'm quite happy with, the AI Gentry. Now, let's get into it with Kairos FM's newest host, Joe Williams.
Okay, sure, yeah. So I'm Joe Williams. I'm a translator, a PhD student from Manchester, England, living in Portugal, who's always had an interest in heterodox economics and with some of the economic transformations that we're experiencing as a result of AI, which have affected me directly and have resulted in a serious reduction in the amount of translation work I'm doing. I'm now looking to pivot and transition into new areas of research, resuming, let's say, my interest in economics and heterodox economics, and wanting to explore the field of AI safety ethics and research.
So, in one sentence, what do you hope to accomplish with this podcast?
So the primary objective for the programs, I suppose, is to get people engaging with the topic of universal basic income and its relevance in the current context, and for people to feel that they can engage more meaningfully with this debate, and have an understanding of the relevance of this debate at the moment.
And so you said just a second ago, you sort of were a translator, and the rise of some of these technologies has really impacted you and your previous work. I guess the question is, first, just tell us a little bit about your professional experience so we know better, where you're coming from.
I've always worked in languages. I've always been a humanist. I've always had academic interest in humanities fields, and I've worked professionally in languages since 2012 when I got my first graduate job, and I was working. I went to work in South Korea as an English teacher, and since then I've been working in languages in one function or another, basically ever since. I decided to transition from teaching into translation in about 2017. And I was working in an NGO called Translators Without Borders for a while as a project manager before I went freelance in early 2018 and set up my freelance business. And then I finished my master's. I did my master's degree in translation studies and delivered my thesis in 2020. That was after doing a BA in history. And then in 2020, I moved here to Portugal um, to partly to because I wanted to learn another language. My only language prior to learning Portuguese was Spanish. I wanted to learn another language so that I could work with that and offer that as a professional translator. So it obviously made sense to learn a language which was closely related to Spanish. So that's what brought me to Portugal, apart from the fact that I've been to Portugal before and really liked it. And yeah, so up until kind of summer last year, translation was going well. And, I'd started doing my PhD in history in 2022. Portugal's a great area to study the kind of field that I'm interested in, which is kind of the relationship between culture and politics in 1930s Europe. And Portugal's, one place which is particularly useful, illustrative in that field. And yeah, so the translation work was going well. 2021, 2024, great years for my translation work. And early 2025 was good. And then in about August, September last year, 2025, things really started falling off a cliff. And clients who'd been sending me, steady a few €100 of work a month just disappeared into thin air. And, I saw people on LinkedIn, everybody sharing these experiences. So many people had just seen their kind of their income just, really, really suffer since a lot of clients, a lot of the people who usually have, contracted a human translator were depending more and more on AI to translate documents and were, automating the translation process to a much higher degree and severely reducing the need for human translators. So at the end of last year, feeling kind of desperate, I was still ticking along just okay with work, but things weren't looking particularly optimistic for me and a lot of other people. So I'm thinking about new alternatives, new ideas, areas I can pivot into. And this field of AI ethics and research just felt, personally relevant because of how it had impacted me directly, personally, had a personal significance. But it also kind of encapsulated some academic and intellectual interests that I'd had for quite a long time. As a humanist, I was always interested in the relationship between, society and technology, human sense of connection with the processes which sustain us and which we're dependent on, and so on and so on. That's something that I've been interested in for a long time, ever since I read Zen and the Arts of Motorcycle Maintenance when I was about 22. So yeah, this field then of AI research and so on, it kind of brought together, kind of encapsulate these different strands. So that's what I've been working on a lot over the past sort of 2, 3, 4 months or so.
And then, okay, a couple follow up questions. I know you also have previous podcast experience. So how did that tie into your work? I guess just briefly, because then I think the thing to really dig into here is about um, the translation work.
Sure, yeah, I left that bit out actually. So after I graduated from my master's in 2020, one field of translation which I was very interested in was literary translation, literary publishing, and so on, which is not the most lucrative area. I've never been the most practical person, actually. Yeah, so I was looking for projects to collaborate with, which would kind of, bring me closer to literature. And I started working with an online literature platform called Traffic Europe, which was run by a guy based in New York called Andrew Singer, sadly passed away in 2023. And he, alongside the Traffic Europe Literary Journal, launched in 2020 a Traffic Europe Radio. So I started working on podcasting back then, mainly focused on contemporary European literature and translation.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And then, yeah, I guess getting back towards the translation and how that played out. I think just to get a better understanding, around August, of 2025, you are experiencing this fall off. Did you follow up with any of those like previous clients and confirm that this was sort of AI driven? I guess would be the first question.
So I didn't start asking some of my old clients specifically, has AI replaced me? Because that would have felt perhaps a little bit gripey and a bit
I suppose.
accusatory. But yeah, I did follow up with some of those clients, some of the what we've called commercial translation agencies that send you, instruction manuals and call for communications and not very interesting text, but you're just kind of bread and butter as a kind of commercial translator. And they would say, yeah, we're just getting fewer and fewer work. We're just getting less and less work in. We're getting fewer and fewer requests coming in. Nothing to do with the quality of your work. I still work for a lot of those clients and agencies. They just send me, a much more reduced amount of work than they used to. And I've also seen some of the managers, and CEOs of some of those translation agencies on LinkedIn posting about the benefits of introducing AI into your workflows and automating the translation processes and so on. So I did sort of put two and two together.
Gotcha. And then do you feel, at least, based on the people that you're working with, or new in this space, or other spaces, is what you're doing a pattern, or what you've done a pattern? Um, is it sort of drying up the work and then therefore people are sort of leaving the space?
Well, yeah, there's been a whole kind of discourse on online platforms, because translators were all very isolated people, we connect mainly online and stuff. Yeah, a whole kind of, slew of people talking about leaving the sector and so on and so on. It just becoming, unviable as a kind of primary source of income and it becoming kind of, treated like a side hustle by, people in the sector, gatekeepers, powerful people in the sector kind of, treating translators as kind of, people who do kind of menial work to supplement another income stream and so on. So yeah, it's definitely a pattern. It's definitely a trend, and it's been, even before AI. These are longer term patterns. These are longer term trends. Because at one point it was Google Translate, DeepL, and all this kind of stuff, which was pretty dodgy when it first came out, but improved and improved and improved because the models changed. It went from kind of translating from word to word to being like cloud based. So the translations improved. So very straightforward, basic, medium kinds of translation, like an instruction manual or something very straightforward. And that lends itself very well to automation because it doesn't really shift on context. It doesn't require a kind of human understanding of cultural context. There's no kind of implicit meanings encoded there operating at the level of subtext. It's just describing you, it's just referring to very specific, very stable semantic relationships between words and objects. So that's the kind of translation that um, a computer can do very well. So yeah, it's a longer term pattern. AI has kind of, accelerated this, to the point where, translation is, yeah, not considered by most people to be, a viable primary source of income unless you're doing very specific kinds of translation. You've got a very specific specialization. You're very well established, and you've got very good relationships, very good long-term established relationships with specific clients who prefer to use humans. But that's kind of, a minority of people. The vast majority of people have seen their work impacted for
So
sure.
also, just to contextualize it, for me, I feel like at least what I see in work that I've conducted, or work that I've looked at, when it's the purely AI generated content, it's not as good in general, and obviously it's not as good, right? But it's good enough, I guess. And so that seemed to me to be sort of what you were hinting at there. Like, if you do want to, go through the process of having a human translator do this, it will be superior, but it will take significantly longer. It will cost significantly more because you're actually paying for someone's time as opposed to buying, a model that was trained off of stolen data. And that difference is not enough for most people to warrant the increase in cost and time.
Well, sure. I mean, all of these decisions have got to be made, according to specific preferences, objectives, criteria, and so on. Some people, not every translation needs to be a work of art. If it's a translation of an instruction manual, which is quite a good example, that doesn't need to,
Yeah.
sing. That doesn't need to be poetic. That just needs to tell the person, put this screw in that
Yes.
hole. So that there's certain forms of translation in which metrics and quality are kind of configured in one way, and some certain other kinds of translation in which quality is defined in other ways. In certain forms of translation, a lot of the kind of metrics to determine quality defined by very bottom line focused commercial translation agencies are about optimization, efficiency, and so on. They don't care whether or not there's a delicate wordplay or a kind of singing, kind of poetic, kind of meter there. They don't care. They just look at kind of how much did this cost, and where's my profit margin, so to speak. So different stakeholders, different actors in the field have got their own values, their own agendas, and so on and so on. And as you say, so people don't care about the text. Not everybody loves language. Some people are business people, and they care about their profit and their bottom line, and that's valid, of course, up to a point. And I don't expect anyone to care too much about the intricacies of translation and kind of delicate, playful, artistic use of language, if that's not what you're interested in, if that's not what your values are. But of course, the people making those decisions according to those logics, and then those decisions are having effects on working conditions, on how certain kinds of is valued. So there's all of those kind of implications which arise from that. And yeah, like you say, AI translation can be downright, fantastic. I mean, when I say fantastic, I mean as in terms of fantasy, just totally disconnected from reality, just make stuff up and all that kind of stuff. So, people are playing, a high stakes game with showing trusting all of your important translations to AI that can very, very, and almost certainly will backfire at some point and come and bite you. Because, AI can perhaps do certain forms of not very interesting, not very difficult translation perfectly well, or at least good enough if you're not really that bothered about language and about translation. But in certain other kinds of translation, in certain other situations where, the stakes might be different, where the success criteria might be different, AI, is not, and, is not on its own, is not, capable of handling that to the same level of, of
Yeah.
quality that a skilled human translator with their kind of, working on it and being given, being paid well enough to give, sufficient amount of time and energy and research to the
Yeah.
job.
Absolutely. And I think that's just not just translation as well. Like you can even see this with writing, copywriting basically.
Absolutely.
Um,
Mhm.
so I think that across the board we're seeing, and again, like you mentioned, this isn't specific to AI necessarily, but a sort of disenfranchising of more beginner type jobs, and I think that that is concerning. Um, but that's actually a great shift into the topic of UBI, or Universal Basic Income. I have two questions. The first is if you could just describe UBI as like straightforwardly as possible. I know that's like a very broad thing, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then following up on that, um, how your experience has informed your interest in that uh, concept.
So UBI, Universal Basic Income, is an economic policy whereby everyone is allocated unconditionally a monthly amount of money. You get paid a set amount of money with no conditionality attached every month. Just not for working, for doing nothing. And it's been an interesting. He's got a broad history. He's got a long history. That idea. Um, and so, what's informing my kind of interest in that? So, again, this is kind of related to some quite interesting topics. But I've always been interested in kind of, values and kind of the relationship between society and economics and kind of why do we have economic growth? What is the kind of higher order objective to which we're kind of subordinating economic growth? Because I don't think I'm alone in this by any means. It's not an original contribution, but I don't think growth is an end in and of itself. I think wealth and prosperity should be created to serve specific values and specific functions. I don't think, creating wealth, in and of itself is just going to lead to better human social outcomes and so on. That wealth has to be created with, directed towards specific objectives and so on. That's a classic Keynesian economic the foundation of classic Keynesian economics. So yes, so like I say, I've always been interested in this topic, and now that it's becoming harder for a lot of people to meet their basic material needs and via work. Now, the kind of employment that's being created and the impact of certain technological developments on wages and so on is making it harder for people to support themselves and meet their basic material needs via paid work. So I think this kind of discussion around UBI and kind of the values to which economic growth is directed starts to acquire sort of new urgency, or at least a kind of renewed necessity. It becomes far more kind of relevant topical conversation to be having in the current economic context.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I also think I do just want to, I guess, log a little bit of pushback on my end for um, the technology aspect. I do think that the technology plays a part, but also I think that it's a lot about the system that it operates in. Um, I don't I don't think that in and of itself technology mandates that people are not able to pay for their own household and monthly uh, like living with a minimum wage job, right? Um, and so, in a way, it's actually, yeah, technology is an amplifier, but the problem is the people and the incentives.
Values,
Yeah,
I suppose. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's absolutely right. And this is part of the thinking on my part around this. Is technology can be used for positive outcomes, or it can be used for less positive outcomes. The technology, a bit like the economic growth itself, isn't necessarily good or bad. It's the kind of outcomes that it produces, the ends to which it's directed. And yes, it's not the technology in and of itself, it's the decisions that are being made by the people who own that technology, decide what impact is going to be, what is the social impact of that technology, which is informed by values. So the conversation that, around this can't, forget, you can't lose sight of kind of the need for values, and you can't view economics as a value-free operation. You can't view technological innovation as value neutral. You've got to be having conversations, and you've got to have a polarity of perspectives represented in those conversations about what do we use these things for. What, that technology can produce a lot of prosperity and wealth, but then what do we do? How is that wealth distributed? How is that prosperity shared in the society? And these are the conversations which need to be had. And the whole kind of impetus around this is to kind of challenge, critique that narrative that is, that economists sometimes perpetuate, and technologists sometimes perpetuate, that they're kind of just doing objective, value neutral, purely technocratic operations, and they just need to be left uninterfered to do what they need to do, and so on. It's like you say, the impacts of those developments, of those innovations, are going to could be, potentially infinite. They're going to reflect the values, the decisions, and so on, and the interests of people in power. So that's exactly right. I think you're right. The technology, it isn't going to do anything on its own. It's how is that technology being wielded and to whose agenda.
Yeah, well, I guess theoretically infinite power, but also like in practice not. It can be large, but I guess that's other another aspect that I want to sort of bring up as a talking point and maybe way to um, try to push back and just see where that gets us is, you know, people have been saying as things become automated, that this new automation will make things as we used to do them, human labor, obsolete. And I mean, that is explicitly what the AI companies are targeting. Um, uh, it's in their, charters and whatever. Um, but also, people have been making these kind of predictions for a long time, and that's it. It hasn't happened before to the extent that it's been predicted. So, do you think this time is different? If so, why?
Sure, yeah. Very valid thing to bring in at this point. That there's nothing new about the claims that technology is going to render us all unemployable. These conversations have been going on for centuries. There was a Roman general in the first or second century that quit his job. He was a military engineer or something.
All right, I'm gonna try to do the correct intonation here, but Joe's referring to Sextus Julius Frontinus, a Roman civil engineer, author, soldier, and senator in the second half of the first century of the Common Era. He wrote Stratagemata, I guess. I don't. Whatever. Okay. Which includes his statement, quote, I will ignore all ideas for new works and engines of war, the invention of which has reached its limit, and for improvement I see no future hope. End quote. Well, really, he didn't say that. He said it in Roman, but you get the point. While this statement was not about a technology undermining work, there have been many times such a claim has been made since. Gutenberg's printing press had many concerns for the jobs of scribes, which seems to have legitimacy, seeing as I don't know any scribes today, although it did happen over a relatively long time frame and didn't completely usurp the profession. Perhaps the most well known historical example of these concerns is that of the Luddites, skilled craftspeople who were being forced out of their livelihoods by new technologies such as the steam powered loom, gig mills, and stocking frames. Actually, that isn't quite accurate. The Luddites were accepting of the innovation, but opposed the systematic degradation of working conditions, reductions in wages, and regression in product quality that the predatory behavior of industrialists resulted in. While their protests often involved the breaking of these machines, their goal was to defend their own autonomy, not prevent progress. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes popularized the term technological unemployment and argued that in 100 years, which, as of recording these asides, is a mere 3.5 years away, we would be 8 times more wealthy and our work week would be reduced to 15 hours. While the GDP of industrialized countries has increased by 4 to 8 times, we are nowhere near being able to sustain oneself by working 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, even in the best of circumstances. In the 1960s, the Triple Revolution Memo ignited discussion that resulted in the proposal of a government funded income guarantee. And in 2013, a paper on the future of employment by Frey and Osborne predicted that 47% of US employment was at risk within the next decade or two, specifically because of AI. I suppose they still have a couple more years before they were unequivocally wrong. So, indeed, these worries are not new.
Because he thought that everything that was possible to invent had been invented. and that was, two
He was
thousand
right.
years
We're
ago.
done. We were done
So,
then.
well, we could, yeah, it might have been better had we stopped developing weapons. But, yeah, so yeah, that's a valid contribution to make. So, like I said, I don't think AI is inventing these necessity. I don't think it's creating exclusively in an unprecedented way as a response to AI. I think there is a sort of renewed need to be having this conversation, as I think there's always a need to be having this conversation when technological development is threatening people's well-being, is threatening people's livelihood, and so on. And I think one angle about this, which again isn't directly related to AI, but is part of the broader context, is that there's an environmental dimension to this. In the basically is a very sort of basic reductive formula kind of, environmental impact is something like population times consumption. And, people needing to work and people going off to work and having a kind of, a growth based economic model based on consumption is having very negative environmental impacts. So this is, not related to AI directly, but as part of the broader picture here at this stage, in human development, we need to be rethinking our economic models in view of the environmental impact they have and our survival as a species. So at that point, a kind of a consumption-based economic growth model starts to look like a very bad idea, in which case we're going to need to have mechanisms in place which allow people to meet their basic needs without necessarily consuming more, without necessarily having to participate in an economy which is predicated on ever increasing growth driven by consumption, because that's just going to end badly. So there's that environmental dimension, which I think is very urgent at the moment, not necessarily related to AI, but as part of the broader context. So I don't know if that answers your
No, yeah,
question.
I think it. I think it does. Yeah, it's not. It's not really that this time is different. It's that this time is a good opportunity to call out something that needs to
Yes.
be discussed.
Oh, sure. If I could just add a couple of things maybe as well, is I think there's something about the digital economy, which is part of what we're looking at the moment, and the kind of perhaps the increased capacity there for concentration of wealth and power. The digital economy as opposed to an old-fashioned kind of, physical goods economy where you're buying, selling things and storing them in markets. You've got these value chains creating different jobs and stuff like this. A digital economy does perhaps lend itself, is perhaps more conducive towards
Yeah,
winner takes all kind of. It's, a few giants. It creates different forms of wealth. And this is what we're kind of seeing with tech companies. We're seeing the emergence of this billionaire tech oligarchy. We haven't quite decided what we're going to call them, but it leads to this concentration of wealth and power in an ever smaller group of people. So that's another part of what I think makes the conversation about UBI more necessary, more relevant in the context of AI and the economic disruption. Is this additional, this kind of, greater obscene amounts of wealth and power in a small number of hands, and the ability of those people then to set agendas and to naturalize their interests and their agendas and
yeah.
so on.
And then the last sort of thing that I want to bring up, because I thought this was interesting. When we were initially talking about this show and you know what is it that it's focusing on? What is it the value that's presented now and into the future? Something that I think about, which is particularly poignant right now because um, of current events. But like as of recording this, when I talk to a lot of people, most believe AI is currently overvalued relative to what it can deliver at this point in time, and like by quite a bit. Uh, and the value is based on arguably unsubstantiable speculation. And given that, so there's this sort of bubble dynamic. And then stack on top of that we have a man with severely progressed dementia leading one of the world's predominant powers, just uh, attacking Iran with Israel, uh, saying all sorts of inflammatory things. There is real risk of shocks, rupturing a bubble, causing the outcome, the landscape, you know, when we release this, or even a couple months after that, to be severely different. Why is this discussion, these discussions, uh, why are these discussions still relevant, regardless of what that looks like?
Sure. So yeah, I've definitely heard those claims that, there's a lot of kind of over exaggerated claims about AI and what it can deliver, and the possibility of a kind of a correction or of a bubble bursting, and so on and so on. A lot of wild and perhaps not very well thought out speculation driving this bubble and so on. And yes, if current political developments and wars around the world do have a negative impact on AI prices and so on, and some of the worth and value of that technology, and some of these kind of more outrageous claims never actually come to fruition, then that's fair. That's a possibility and something that needs to be borne in mind. Although I would still argue that um, critiquing and engaging critically with powerful people and their agendas and the way they try and universalize and naturalize their needs, their what do you say, their interests, in and of itself valuable to to remain engaged critically with politics, with economics, and so on and so on. This is vital, dependent of irrespective of what certain outcomes transpire around this. People need to be actively participating and listening and thinking and challenging certain, positions. That in itself is valuable because, a bit like we were talking about before with technology and economics and stuff, these, systems, they're not, gods. They're not, even if I like to talk about them as if they were, they are, they are the product of human labor, human creativity, and so on. And they are shaped by human decision makers. So anything that is produced and shaped and brought into existence by human decision makers can also be challenged, contended, argued by other humans with different perspectives and so on. So having that debate and having more voices represented in that debate and having more people actively participating and critically contending those positions is valuable in and of itself. And if the AI bubble does burst and so on, then okay, fair enough. But I don't think anyone's going to kind of regret looking back and going, oh, we should have just, not giving it any thought and kind of just let it play out because, any kind of positive human social progress has been, the product of people not doing that, people being engaged and people being active and participating and so on. So yeah, just there's a claim here, there's an argument to be made for just always remaining engaged and active, in politics and listening to powerful people and the way they talk and the stories they tell to rationalize and naturalize their power and not taking it at face value and and looking at where the kind of the biases and the specificity is in those narratives.
Yeah, and that's a really good, again, like, transition to the next section, which I want to talk about, because it's not just UBI that you're focused on. It's specifically the discourse, especially the discourse from so-called AI elites. Like, I think is the word that probably the media uses the most. I personally don't like that. I would propose AI Gentry. I think AI oligarchs is also reasonable. Something that's a little bit demeaning, I think, is nice though. Um,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is why I kind of like Gentry. But I'll use that, or if we'll figure it out. But again, like, help me understand uh why, or how uh we would be doing this, what maybe precedent there is, because I'm sure that this has been talked about. It's not really my area of expertise. So just understanding, like, what you mean by analyzing the discourse, and also talking a little bit more about why.
Sure, yeah. Point taken about terminology. We don't need to get bogged down in semantics necessarily, but I hear the kind of the distinction that you're making. AI gentry sounds potentially usable. AI oligarchy, it reminds me of the idea of tech feudalism, AI gentry, so that could work quite well. So yeah, so the discourse from AI, let's call them the AI gentry for now. The AI gentry is a specific viewpoint, which is the product of a specific worldview, which is conditioned by a specific set of experiences and a way of understanding the world. And it has its validity. It is, I'm not trying to say there's absolutely nothing there to be to dismiss out of
You
hand.
aren't.
We could maybe discuss that, but the point is to kind of not let people naturalize and universalize what is specific. If I say, because of my position in the world, that I see things in a certain way, that doesn't mean that that's an objective truth. And that kind of reflects all human experiences and speaks to all humans as kind of equal and so on and so on. That is my specific human subjective position. And it has its own biases, it has its own assumptions, it reflects its own interests and values and so on. So the kind of the core principle, the foundation is exactly this to kind of, make sure that we're not kind of letting powerful people naturalize and centralize is specific to their interests and their values as kind of universal. And it relates to what Gramsci would have called hegemony, which is exactly this, where you universalize what is specific and you present what is one group's interests as being in the wider interests. And this is what some of the discourse is seeking to do. Now, some of the discourse could be characterized by a certain triumphalism, a certain kind of vision of technology as kind of triumphing and being inherently superior morally, technically to all other kind of disciplines. And it leads to a sort of utopia whereby tech elites, tech oligarchs, tech gentry, their position of power and wealth is not challenged. Things are allowed to develop as the way that they're going. And UBI in that narrative appears as a kind of mechanism for propping up that status quo without challenging any of the power inequalities and the wealth inequalities, which is a narrative which I think a lot of us might take issue with because it would not challenge inequality. There'd still be gross inequalities. There would still be people with very dubious intentions and very limited understandings of the world making very powerful decisions which affect all of us. We would be, in a way, kind of feudal, kind of serfs in some ways. We might not be starving to death, but we would be subject to the wills and the caprices and the fancies of some unstable and undesirable people. So while that narrative may have a certain superficial appeal to it, if we kind of scratch away and we place it in context and we look at kind of what's kind of implied and what is assumed and what is taken to be universal may not be universal, we can see a certain kind of ideological position being disseminated. And one kind of central idea in something called critical discourse analysis is that I'm not just in critical discourse analysis in a range of kind of, humanistic and social science fields, is that ideologies quite often are at their most effective when they're most dangerous when they're presenting themselves not as ideologies, but as reflections of natural facts and so on. Many totalitarian ideologies have done this and said, we're not an ideology, we're just presenting the world as it actually is, and our worldview is just a reflection of objective natural biological facts. Where I live in Portugal, there was a dictatorship from 1926 to 1974, and then in 1933, a guy took over called Salazar. There was an ideology called Salazarism, and that is one of the classic characteristics of Salazarism, which is a far-right authoritarian ideology presenting itself as a reflection of the natural order of things, as I would have put it. And this happens on left-wing politics too. Some, forms of classical doctrinaire Marxism like to present themselves as scientific and objective, and so on and so on. This is just a problem with right-wing ideologies. This happens on extreme left-wing ideologies, and so on and so on. So I realize I probably drifted slightly away from the question, but but basically unpacking, decoding, and engaging critically with what powerful people say with their narratives is something which I think is vital that we continue to always.
Yeah. And then I guess also just to again sort of like set the stage here, who are we talking about when we say the AI Gentry? Because I think that there is a little bit of an intuition as to who that is, but I think it's also
Mhm.
valid and valuable to explicitly call it out.
Sure, absolutely. So I think that's very true. And I think what you're doing there is very consistent with the spirit of the program, which is kind of trying to avoid any simplistic and reductive kind of, narratives and kind of putting some kind of idealized abstraction of evil, the comic book villain
Oh, it
in his
doesn't need to
mountain, in
not
his
be that.
laboratory.
We can still think of them that
Yeah.
way.
But we could also nuance that understanding in a more empirical way as well. Um, and yeah, this is one aspect of the research that I'm currently engaged in. And I spoke to somebody this week who was very interested in a discourse analysis who also works in tech called Hector Perez Urbina. Let me just double check that that's the right name, so I won't want to get his
That's
name
correct.
wrong. Yeah, Hector Perez Urbina. And he's written a piece of research which was a kind of condensation of his master's thesis, in which he's very critical, or at least he engages very critically with discourse from AI, powerful AI oligarchs. And he wants to kind of nuance some of that understanding to a certain extent. And he actually finds that there is a kind of plurality of perspectives within what we can characterize as AI gentry and so on. It's not a homogeneous monolith. There is commonality, and we can think of them as this category for sure, but there are also kind of within that a certain range of perspectives. Now, somebody like Elon Musk doesn't really need much of an introduction to people, I'm sure, but he would be, one of the scariest of these people, one of the most kind of easy to demonize and justifiably so of these people. But there are also other people within this category who don't necessarily kind of agree with it. They don't agree on everything. They agree on certain things. Elon Musk likes UBI. He supports UBI. He's been vocal on this. But Mark
Mark
Andreessen, and I always
Andreessen.
mess up the pronunciation. Mark Andreessen, for instance, he doesn't like UBI. So there are points of contention between these people. Then you got someone like Sam Altman, who was the who worked on OpenAI, and he is also pro universal basic income, but probably with a different perspective, working from a different set of assumptions than Elon Musk.
If you're like me, you hate hearing more about Sam Altman. But for a number of reasons, it is interesting to look at his behavior with regards to UBI in particular. Back in 2016, when he was still involved with Y Combinator, Altman published a blog post where he announced that the nonprofit YC Research would be funding a 5-year study on basic income. 1 year after Altman's not entirely amicable exit from Y Combinator, those 5 years were up, so the group restructured independently and rebranded to OpenResearch. In 2024, they published their findings. The big ones were that while unconditional cash can alleviate short term financial difficulties and had some positive impacts on parents in particular, the broader claims that are often made about UBI, for example, that it may resolve healthcare inequality, were soundly rejected. Then there's Worldcoin, or I guess it's just World now because of course it is. Founded in 2019 as Altman left Y Combinator, Worldcoin combines crypto, AI, and multi level marketing tactics to get users to allow the company to scan and store their biometric data, specifically their irises. If that didn't set off enough alarm bells, don't worry, Andreessen Horowitz is one of its main backers. So, why is this relevant? Well, the founders have explicitly styled WorldCoin as, quote, a potential path to AI funded UBI. It's likely unsurprising to you then that, essentially, since its inception, WorldCoin has been neck deep in controversy, including allegations of predatory tactics typical of cryptocurrencies, market manipulation, and low income population exploitation.
So part of the program is I want to fill out that picture. I want to have a clearer, more detailed, more nuanced understanding of that picture. Yeah, recognizing where the kind of, the genuinely antisocial kind of evil um, impulses are, the kind of destroyer of worlds kinds of archetypes that exist, but also kind of recognizing that some of these people um, perhaps don't conform with exactly that model. And just to be perhaps a bit provocative here as well, there's an important discussion to have here about what might be called sort of pragmatists versus true believers. Do I elites believe their narrative, or is it a rationally self-interested rhetorical move strategy in order to get what they want? And this applies always to people in positions of power whose reality may be tenuous at best, without wanting to make apologies for these people or say that there's no accountability, because of course there is. Some people can believe what they need to believe. People have a mechanism, they can believe what's in their interest to believe, and people can convince themselves of some very far out things when they need to. The myth, however fanciful and fantastic it is, will persist as long as people need it to for some people. So while there is undoubtedly, I'm sure, some very shrewd and very rationally self-interested people operating within that category, there may be some people who are really sucked into their worldview and incapable of, recognizing how their worldview is perhaps, very far removed, very divorced from a lot of people's experiences and so on and so on. So these are all parts of the equation, parts of the situation I want to explore deeper and fill out in the programs.
And then I guess just to like make it concrete as well, I guess for me, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think of sort of AI gentry and who that is, it's like Sam Altman, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Dario Amodei, Dennis Hassabis, Satya Nadella, um, Mark Andreessen for sure. Um, you know, these relatively vocal individuals who and some in some cases not as vocal as well, like Tim Cook, I think, for example, um, but relatively known, vocal people who are leading uh, some of these AI companies or the investment going into them. Um, and Peter Thiel is another one that I would throw up there. Um, but yeah, so just am I missing anyone that you think is like particularly um, emblematic of this AI gentry?
No, I don't think so. At least not at this stage in my research. I'm currently reading Karen Howe, The Empire of AI, which I'm sure will be very instructive and very informative. So that may develop, that may evolve as the programs evolve. But I think you've offered a good summary. You've encapsulated the main figures.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another thing that I'm gonna put on my let's maybe see say uncharitable slash skeptical slash um, suspicious hat, which is one that I wear often. It is one that I'm usually wearing, actually, just by default, but explicitly acknowledging that I am doing so. Um, these people are powerful. Like you said, they have lots of money, and that's really essentially all that means here. But then, by proxy of that, or by virtue of that, they have, you know, access to people and information and all that sort of stuff. So they are incentivized to promote things that are in their interest. For example, Elon Musk says he likes UBI. That immediately is a red flag to me. Um, Maybe we can talk about like why that might be the case, what are the concern is there, um, and some of the nuances of engaging with UBI as one of these individuals, and why that might not be what it seems at first glance.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's a great question, of course. So, of course, EBI, as any other kind of measures, any other kind of proposal, should not be accepted uncritically, and it shouldn't be idealized, and it shouldn't be held up as a kind of magic bullet to solve all human social economic ills and so on. So yes, absolutely. Let's question ABI. Let's have a critical debate about UBI. Sorry, about UBI, and let's not accept anything as a given or uncritically. That's very not in the spirit of this program. So responding to some of this, then yeah. So again, one of the central premises of the program is that AI Gentry actors have dubious, perhaps not very pro-social agendas, motivations informing their support for UBI. Because if UBI were implemented today without any kind of restructuring of economic of the economy or politics and so on, it would basically be like an apology. It would be a kind of scaffold to prop up and support and maintain this deeply unequal status quo, this political, social, economic inequality that we're experiencing. And yes, people like Elon Musk like it because they want to maintain this deeply unequal social economic model that we've got. So you're definitely right to really foreground that. So one way of approaching this is to see UBI not as a kind of measure in and of itself that will kind of lead to more positive outcomes, but kind of part of a set of measures towards a more transformative and fairer economic, more progressive economic model. So UBI shouldn't be kind of abstracted and isolated and seen as functioning purely on its own, but it should be seen as kind of part of a repertoire of responses, one which is a very useful one, but one which in and of itself, if not kind of applied critically and kind of tailored to adapt to specific contexts and realities, isn't necessarily automatically going to result in better outcomes for people, a fairer, more just, progressive society and economy, and so on. So, in light of that, there's perhaps a need to, like I say, take a step back from UBI and frame it and contextualize it in a broader, more progressive, transformative economic agenda. So this is kind of part of what the program's kind of analysis of UBI is going to work from. UBI from a kind of in a context as part of a kind of packet of a set of measures informed by you know by philosophical, slightly abstract philosophical and ethical reflections on what are our values as a society, what kind of activity do we want to reward, do we want to encourage, what kind of activity do we want to discourage, and so on and so on. So it's crucial that we're having this conversation as a kind of um, UBI seeing as kind of like on a sort of lower level category within a kind of broader constellation of measures and a different set of values geared towards achieving different kind of society, and so on and so on.
I think that the concern that I have the most, in addition to effectiveness, which I know is something that's uh, less the focus here, because there are a number of other people talking about this as well, but more about the discourse. But I think that it almost feels like a false flag kind of operation, as I was saying earlier, um, because this direct cash provision to individuals is, like you said at the beginning when introducing it, uniform across everyone, and we actually have already in place systems to allocate more funds to the people who need it more. Now, those are being dismantled actively, at least in the US, but we do have them in theory, and I think they're generally good. And I have experienced sort of not UBI explicitly, but in Colorado, there's this thing called Tabor, which effectively gives money back to people, to the people in Colorado that are taxed if they bring in more than was expected. But it goes back uniformly to the people that were taxed. And that means that the state can't spend it on welfare programs that would actually help the people who need it the most. Um, so I see this as having like a similar problem, and that is also like a key reason why someone like Elon Musk might be or likely is like interested in it. Yeah, I guess, I mean, it aligns with what you were just talking about, but I guess I'd be interested to have a conversation a little bit more about that aspect.
Oh yeah, definitely a very useful, necessary dimension to bring in for sure. So I don't think I can respond directly, specifically
Sure.
to that concern at this stage, although I will kind of perhaps just throw a couple of things out there which might be relevant. Um, is that there is a real danger with UBI if it isn't accompanied by a kind of a broader transformation and a transformative kind of economic agenda, in that it could end up being basically transferring public money to the private sector, in the sense that you have the government paying people money, but then people need to use that money to pay rent, to access services and resources to which are held by private individuals, perhaps a subscription to OpenAI, to ChatGPT, to Claude, or whatever. So in that sense, in that scenario, you've almost got something like, transferring public money, taxpayer money, back into AI elites or back into any kind of powerful economic sector, which would be very counterproductive, which would feel like like it's backfired. So there are these potential backfires and so on and so on. So you're dead right to call that out. All of these measures need to be, placed in specific context and kind of modeled and carefully and empirically and so on. And one aspect of this conversation could be, instead of framing it as universal basic income and sending people money, you could have universal basic services. You could have government money being used to provide what people need, energy, housing, and so on and so on. So that way you're not really funding a kind of, a capitalist elite or oligarchy, or how we're expressing it. You're kind of giving people the things that they need, so they don't necessarily need to buy things. They're not necessarily kind of dependent on paying rent to access the resources which they depend on, and so on. So that could be one aspect to incorporate here. But yeah, the kind of the mechanics, the kind of very very specific nuts and bolts of it, are things I'm still looking into, and hopefully I'll have some clearer answers on some
Sure.
of these
No, yeah,
things.
that's really interesting. I think that, yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to look into. It's also maybe less palatable to some of the people that it needs to be palatable to in order to get passed in the first place. Um, which, yeah, no shit, but like also it might be necessary. So the last area in terms of like talking about the AI gentry, so to speak, um, is, I mean, it's also very much like a Silicon Valley kind of notion here. And what we've essentially been saying is like this is ideologically motivated. Um, not likely. It is ideologically motivated. The ideology that is motivating it may be different for some of these different AI gentry, but there are motivations here, and we can
Things, yeah.
see that in the discourse. So, given that, um, how do we make sense of what people are talking about and what people are bringing to the table?
I see. So when we say people, we're
Sorry,
talking about
yes.
AI
When
gentry.
the AI gentry
Yeah, yeah.
bring these
Yes.
ideas to the table, maybe like what's a good way to start engaging with it?
So yeah, I asked Hector Perez Urbina about this, and he had some very interesting things to say. And some of it is kind of, without wanting to sound dismissive or patronizing, is common sense. Is just about not swallowing everything you're given to swallow. It's about when you're reading something, to kind of, as a thought experiment, as a kind of intellectual operation, so to speak, try and disagree with it. Think of things to disagree with it about. Now, if you're engaging with a person, or you're speaking to a friend, that's not necessarily always the best thing to do, because you might end up coming across as a quarrelsome idiot. But when you're kind of, alone, and you're reading something, kind of put on a kind of stern, I don't agree with this, I'm going to prove this wrong kind of mentality when you're reading and you're engaging and so on. So there's just a kind of a foundation of kind of, yeah, this is a story. This is something that somebody has made up. anything that he's constructed discursively, so to speak, a story that he's made up, a different story could be made up to explain that same thing. Anything that is constructed could be deconstructed. Any idea could be engaged with critically. That's kind of, that's the foundation, Anyone who kind of puts things in a certain way has a certain reason, certain perspective, which is informing their understanding. Doesn't necessarily render their understanding totally invalid, but it does kind of make it specific. So just to remember that there's, it, it, when we're making up stories as human beings, they're inevitably subjective. They're inevitably specific. Some stories are more robust and more kind of, seem to correspond to reality in more meaningful ways than others. I'm not making like a radical relativist claim where, there is no such thing as a fact and every opinion is as valid as another, because that just leads to some very irreconcilable paradoxes and some undesirable outcomes. But yeah, look for the things that are being, claimed as universal, because like I was saying before, this is, something which somebody's ears should be pricking up at is when somebody is saying that something is like an objective fact and he's saying something is, unquestionable and natural and objective. Look at those things. Those are the things which are sometimes the most ideological, sometimes the most heavily charged ideological language is presented as value free, as neutral. So look for claims of neutrality, of objectivity, and so on. Look for things which resemble kind of articles of faith rather than kind of nuanced and balanced, constructed um, arguments, intellectual positions, and so on. Because things which are kind of operate as dogmas, as things which are kind of true, and function like faith and modes of thought which resemble religious modes of thought. Again, look at those because those might not necessarily be the most kind of convincing and the most robust kind of arguments that stand a lot of critical scrutiny. So look for things which are unqualified, i.e., things which are very emphatic and categorical, black and white, that are very kind of very heavy-handed and not nuanced and not balanced, and so things which are kind of very very excessive and so on. And apart from that is to contextualize, read something that somebody's read, and then learn a bit more about that person, read other things that they've read and see if you could see a certain patterns developing, certain themes, certain modes of expression, that are consistent, that perhaps might isolated might not seem that significant, but when understood as a kind of in a pattern, as a kind of, they may have an accumulative sort of effect, and so on. And just to, always, always, always just, be remembering that, stories um might be valid, they might correspond to reality in meaningful ways, but we can always make up other stories to make sense of the world, and so on and so on. I suppose I don't know if that answers your question
I think it
necessarily.
does. The only thing then is like, oh, that sounds like a lot of work.
Oh yeah, it is, and we're all busy. This is kind of what I'm interested in with the UBI thing as well. Is how do we find the time to to do all the things that we need to do to to pay to work our jobs and to pay our bills and da, 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 So it is a lot of work. Um, at the same time, it can also be rewarding. It can also be a fun intellectual exercise. It also affects us all very directly. So, it's the kind of thing that might be worth working at. And it could, like I say, I've always been a linguist and someone who's interested in narratives and, how narratives kind of encode, political or ideological positions and so on. So I find it fun. You look at it as, a code cracking exercise, a kind of riddle to be solved, and so it can be, stimulating intellectually, and it's also, it's if you've got time and energy to be, to invest in engaging in this kind of thing, reading discourse critically, and so on and so on, it's probably quite a worthwhile thing to do. The implications, the practical outcomes, from these narratives, they're not just insignificant, powerful people telling themselves stories to make sense of their world. These people are some of the richest, most powerful people in the world. So, it might be worthwhile. It might be worth the work.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. So I do have a couple, I guess, closing questions. One that's still somewhat relevant to that, and then a couple more that are just about the podcast in general to get a better understanding. But um, so you want to foster critical engagement with this concept and with how we interact with discourse from the AI Gentry. Um, but then you also do have your own perspective here, and an experience which informs that. And um, from how I'm seeing it, that would understandably make it difficult to and maybe wrong even to engage in a wholly neutral way. Um, how do you plan to balance the tension between those things in the show?
Sure, that's a good question. So the first thing that I'll say, foreground from the very beginning, is I have my values. I have beliefs. I believe things. I think certain things are more valuable and more
Me too.
worthwhile than certain other things. Um, I don't make any secret of that. So I will foreground that the way that I'm making sense of things and my perspectives and so on and so on reflects my specific worldview, my specific values, and so on. I will try to avoid making claims to value neutrality and objectivity. I mean, objectivity is perhaps a bit different because there is such a thing as an objective fact, but what we make that fact mean inevitably reflects our own kind of assumptions of worldview and so on. So yeah, I'm not going to be trying to kind of present my narrative as a reflection of natural truths. This is something I think that people are more likely to do, and there's a propensity to do this with the more power and prestige you get. Power can turn people into terrible people, obviously. Um, I'm not necessarily the world's most powerful person. I'm not in the world's most marginalized person either. But I will hopefully kind of, foreground and kind of, signal the specificity of my own narratives and my own perspectives from Sean. My aim here is not to present a value neutral discussion. My aim here is to articulate as well as I can what I believe to be the case based on the information I have and my capacity to make sense of the world around me. And people can tell me if they think I've overlooked something. So yeah, I suppose there's no kind of specific measures necessarily, just general principles around critical thinking and critical thinking skills and openness to engage and to question your own thinking and so on. And that's kind of just a general kind of framework which we'll aspire to as I'm making the program. Which
Nice. All right. So we've talked about this whole idea here. Who do you think it's for? Who is your target audience? Obviously, anyone who's listening is more than welcome. But who do you have in mind when you've been designing it and working on this?
so my ideal kind of listenership, I suppose, would definitely be people who don't fit into any specific field, people who have got a range of backgrounds, professional, intellectual interests, and so on, but are interested in the impact of technological development and economic growth on all of us as individuals and as society in general. So that hopefully I feel it has a broad appeal, a general appeal. Hope it doesn't exclude people or feel kind of elitist or kind of excessively technical. I hope plenty of people out there kind of, are interested in this topic because it contains certain themes which I think are, I hesitate to say the word universal based on my last answer, but questions about, why do we have technology? Why do we have economic growth? What objectives do we direct these things to? There's a degree of, if not universality, a broad appeal here. I feel that, these are implications which affect a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of us would have, opinions on whether or not we think it's a good idea for tech to develop in such a way that concentrates wealth and power in the way that it does. So, to give the classic example of, the development of the atomic bomb, which was, technically an absolute triumph, but which people might have said, from a human perspective was actually abhorrent. I'm sure people have got their own perspectives on that, and I hope that people, whoever listens to this program, will be people who are interested in these very broad questions about, values, about why do we develop, why do we innovate, why do we create wealth and prosperity, what are our priorities. So hopefully that is, that will appeal to people from a range of perspectives, because it would be great if we could have a range of perspectives and avoid kind of echo chamber sort of dynamics and stuff.
So, and then how do you plan to ensure that this podcast is accessible across that spectrum of people?
So one thing that I'll say here is that I wouldn't necessarily call myself an expert on something like UBI. Yes, I've talked about, I've had an interest in heterodox economics for a long time, but I put that by the wayside a few years ago when I started my master's in translation, for instance. I was working in an NGO, to a large extent, in 2017, because I had certain values and certain beliefs around, um, social models and economic models and so on and so on. But, since like sort of 2018, with, having done a master's in translation studies and having to focus, like I say, having commitments, my interest in a lot of these things is dormant, has been, on the side, to say the least, over the past few years. So I'm not necessarily an expert. I'm kind of exploring and learning as I'm making the programs. So I'll be hopefully, or at least, aspiring to be approaching this with a kind of curious kind of learner's mentality and exploratory sort of, sensibility, in a way which perhaps might, hopefully will be reflected in the programs, which perhaps might contribute to making them accessible to people like me who aren't necessarily experts. Um, I'm definitely, if I'm a bit of a Luddite, well, I'm not a Luddite necessarily, but I'm not very tech savvy. Conversations around technology kind of go over my head, in a lot of ways. So I need some of the people that I speak to these programs to keep things simple for me too. So hopefully, perhaps, the fact that I'm not necessarily an expert, I'm a little bit of a kind of outsider to some of this myself, with, a degree of interest and a degree of prior knowledge, but not necessarily an expert. Perhaps that might, can, be conducive to that, to making it accessible to non-experts. And yeah, I'll just kind of be very mindful and careful, conscious of using excessive amounts of technical terminology and vocabulary and so on. And hopefully that kind of results in content which people can relate to.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I think it's going to be really good, and I am excited to hear it. Oh, you're still here? I figured you would have already headed over to the new Kairos FM show, Beyond the Paycheck, hosted by this episode's guest, Joe Williams. You haven't already? Your loss, I guess. Well, I guess you're probably just being polite and wanting to wait until I'm done rambling. So, seriously though, you should check it out. I think you'll like it.